seminars that UNITAR is organising to introduce you firstly to the Declaration on Trade and Women's Economic Empowerment, and then across the next 4 months of the coming year we're going to go deeper into the matters of substance, as you see on the concept note which is before you. So it is my great pleasure to introduce Mr. Ravi El-Haddad, who is the manager of the Trade and Diplomacy Program at UNITAR, who'll be making some opening remarks on behalf of Mr. Nikhil Seth, Executive Director, UNITAR. Ravi, you have the floor.
Meg, thank you very much. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished colleagues and friends. First of all, it's a great pleasure to be here and in the presence, the spiritual presence of dear friends. And this is the last activity, hopefully, before Christmas, so we consider it as a Christmas gift, as a preparation, psychological preparation for a well-deserved vacation. So I just wanted to wish you a warm welcome, to say that it is our pleasure to be embarked on this journey with Meg and the whole team that is present here with us today on trade and women's economic empowerment. For UNITAR, it is extremely important. We launched 3 years ago the Women's Leadership Program because we are determined to be working in this field. It's an interagency program that is working towards empowering female delegates here in Geneva and abroad. We are, of course, working hand in hand with all the actors and the main driving forces related to this in Geneva and outside. And we are determined to be working also with you, Meg, in the coming years so that we make sure that this seminar is the first seminar towards implementing further seminars that will help us understand on how we can implement the Declaration on Trade and Women's Economic Empowerment that was adopted, as you know, at the World Trade Organization's conference, Ministerial Conference last week. Our dear friend from the Geneva Press Club already presented our dear panelists, and I think you are going to do the same, so it's useless for me to go there. I just wanted to thank His Excellency Ambassador Asperund of Iceland and Her Excellency Ambassador Yvette Stevens, and also Arantxa Gonzalez, the Executive Director of ITC, who were instrumental, who are the co-chairs of the Trade Impact Group of the International Gender Champions. So they were the driving force behind the declaration, as you know, and I wanted to thank them on behalf of UNITAR for this, and to say that Meg is a dear friend and a brilliant colleague. And I just wish you would transform this into a very interactive session with her and our distinguished panelists. Thank you for being here, and Meg, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ravi, for those very kind words. So welcome, good afternoon. It's a great pleasure to have you here. So let me outline for you how this session is going to work so you can see where you have opportunities to interact. The way we've structured this session is that we go first to Ambassador Asperund to hear straight how Buenos Aires was. He's going to bring Buenos Aires alive for us. He's going to speak a little bit about the antecedents, about his work on the Trade Impact Group that is part of the International Gender Champions, the formulation of the declaration, and take us to Buenos Aires so you can get a sense of what transpired there. Then, of course, we're moving actively to implementation, looking at how countries like the Kingdom of the Netherlands are planning to take the work forward. We've invited the Netherlands to speak today because, as you know, they have a brilliant track record already of gender equality and women's empowerment, and they are sensitive to the integration of small and medium-sized enterprises into the global economy. So we have invited the Netherlands to speak with us today. Then, of course, we're not going to get anywhere on this agenda unless we have institutional support. So we have the World Bank with us today. The World Bank have a very active program that Pierre Salvé is going to take us through. Just touch on it. Unfortunately, time is limited. He's just going to touch on some of the important aspects. You saw in the declaration specifically references trade facilitation, procurement, data analysis. These are some very key areas that we'll be specifically focusing on going forward. So Pierre is going to share some insights from the bank in that regard. And then there's always the legal dimension. So we have Dr. Arthur Appleton with us. Dr. Appleton is the partner in Appleton Luff Law Firm. I've been working on trade for some years. So this is our panel. So the panelists will take just a few minutes to share with you their perspective from either the government, institutional, or legal perspectives. Then we're going to go to a Q&A. Yeah. So if you hear something you'd like to ask questions, the opportunity will be there for you to interact with the panelists. Then I'm going to ask the panelists for what are the next steps in your organization, your government, on implementation of the Declaration on Trade and Women's Economic Empowerment. What are you planning to do? And then we're going to close out with just one sentence takeaway from each of the panelists to hone your thoughts and provide some guidance on where to from here. So today's the 19th of December. For your colleagues and partners who aren't here today, I know many are still in Buenos Aires, great country, or on holidays. As the gentleman from the Press Club said, this is being webcast, so you can share the link to today's session. And then, of course, we look forward to seeing you on the 22nd of January, which will be the next in the series provided by UNITAR. So, without any further ado, it's my pleasure to present the Ambassador of Iceland, Harald Aspelund. He's the permanent representative of Iceland to the UN and other international organizations in Geneva, including the WTO, so wears both hats there. He has previously served as the director of the Directorate for External Trade and Economic Affairs in the Ministry for Foreign Affairs, and the Director of Human Resources, remembering, of course, women's empowerment is also, we need to look at the staffing aspects there. Human Resources in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and he's previously served as Minister, Councillor, Deputy Permanent Representative to the missions of Iceland in both Geneva and New York. And so, Ambassador, take us to Buenos Aires.
Thank you, Meg. And I thank UNITAR for organizing this event and giving me the opportunity to speak at this moment so shortly after Buenos Aires, where we, among 170 other members and observers of WTO, I believe that we made a little bit of a history there by joining on this declaration on trade and economic empowerment of women. Maybe I have it here. Okay, that's mine. First, briefly about the background of the declaration. It was initiated by the Trade Impact Working Group, which was mentioned here. That was established 1 year ago in December 2016 under the auspices of the International Gender Champions here in Geneva. The group was established to galvanize the Geneva community on the issue related to trade and gender and the empowerment of women. The group aims to raise the visibility of trade and gender, to facilitate sharing of good practices, identify points of entry where gender barriers can be addressed, and to provide practical guidance on how best to do it. The group has been co-chaired by Sierra Leone, Iceland, and the ITC, and it's open to all WTO members and the international organizations here in Geneva. Briefly about what the declaration is about. The members in support, they agreed to firstly to share experiences through WTO information exchange relating to policies and programs, aiming at encouraging women's participation in the economy. Secondly, to share best practices for conducting gender-based analysis of trade policies. Thirdly, to share methods for collection of data and analysis of gender-focused statistics. Fourthly, to work together to remove barriers and to increase women's participation in trade. And fifthly, to ensure that the Aid for Trade provides tools and know-how for more gender-responsive trade policies. And finally, there is a list of series of seminars that the members decide to hold to discuss a number of themes related to the issue. A week before we went to Buenos Aires, we had only half of these on the list, but we ended up with almost 120 supporters of the declaration, which was, I would say, extremely emotional for us that have been working on it before. And the event itself, this photo gets you a little bit into the atmosphere of the place. It was extremely moving. It was very loud and confusing. There were many heads of delegations there, many ministers. The plan was to have a quiet family photo of those that were supporting, but it ended up in a chaos. And it was extremely moving, and for us that have been working on it, extremely emotional, as you can see. But this was the planned handing over of the declaration, and here is a close-up photo of the handing over. It was in the middle of this chaos, and on that photo you can see the three co-chairs, Yvette Stevens, Ambassador of Sierra Leone, Arantxa González from ITC, and Guðlaugur Þór, the Foreign Minister of Iceland, as well as the Foreign Minister of Canada, handing over the declaration to the chair. But this was in the middle of all this loud noise and chaos that was there. It was so much fun, a lot of laugh. It was followed by a press conference, where in the panel we had Yvette Stevens, the Ambassador of Sierra Leone, which, by the way, I thank very much for her leadership on the issue. She has been doing an enormous job to make this come true. And the foreign ministers of Canada, Kenya, Iceland, and Argentina, the host. The Director General of WTO was there as well. And Arantxa González, the Executive Director of the ITC. Finally, this was the atmosphere, this was the laugh and the fun we had. And I would very much like to thank Arantxa González for her positive and really happy approach to the issue, which is very important when you are dealing with such an issue, and her great enthusiasm. Her initiative or her enthusiasm made this, I would say, important initiative to become a success. I thank Arantxa. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Aspelund, for taking us to Buenos Aires and also for the background on the declaration itself. You had on the slide there the 5 areas in which the WTO member states have undertaken commitments to follow through on in the coming 2 years. It's a 2-year agenda. Moving now to the Netherlands, we have here with us this afternoon, we're delighted to have Ms. Elspeth Akkerman with us. Ms. Akkerman is the Netherlands Deputy Permanent Representative to the World Trade Organization, and she also heads the Economic Affairs section of the Netherlands Mission to the United Nations and other international organisations in Geneva. The economic section is the one responsible for trade and development issues and closely cooperates with Geneva-related based organisations such as UNCTAD, ILO, ITC, you mentioned, WIPO, and the World Economic Forum. Before taking her on her current position, she was acting director of the International Trade Policy and Economic Governance Department of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which has core responsibilities for trade policy, policy on corporate social responsibility, and export controls on strategic goods. And so, Ms. Akkerman, over to you. So what is the expected impact and what routes do you see for achieving women's economic empowerment through trade?
Thanks, Meg, and thank you, Ambassador, for bringing us back to Nairobi. I was there as well. I saw myself in the picture, and I can assure you that this was really one of the more happier moments of the conference, and I guess an actual result. And I was proud to be part of that process, and also we were proud to have been in that moment, which it really was. And I think it's an out-of-the-box way of having a very actual topical matter included in a very important policy lines. And the fact that we did not a signatory thing, but we took a picture of all those people helps, because you're in the picture and it says more than paper. You said, so what is the expected impact and what routes will we need to pursue from here? I think that, let me start by saying that in the Netherlands we see trade and investment as very important drivers for economic growth, and then inclusive and responsible economic growth. And as such, trade and investment are instrumental to achieving SDGs and Agenda 2030. And it is proven knowledge that increasing women's economic participation to the level of men will lead to growth in world GDP of 26% in 2025. These numbers I think, speak for themselves. Women empowerment, empowering women to take part in business, to take part in international trade, is a business case in itself. However, and there comes, let's say, the Dutch perspective or the Netherlands perspective, we also see that or think that women empowerment, empowering women to trade is the right thing to do, because it is a matter of rights. Women's empowerment in business is a way to have women participate in employment, in education, and it empowers and enables women to have the right to own both your business or property. So we think that women empowerment in general, it brings freedom, it makes business better, and it brings stability worldwide. So as I said, a business case and the right and a rights thing to do. So when I touch upon your question, what is the impact? I think that national governments and international organizations, as from now, will engage stronger in actually pursuing this topic. It should be an inspiration, but it should also be an incentive to put our money where our mouth is and also to walk the talk. This is paper, what we did in Buenos Aires, but now we really need to bring it into practice. And as I said, the picture might help. You know, you're in there, so we know where to find you. So gender should be part and parcel of trade policy and also of trade agreements. That would be our aim. And as a starting point, we need research and we need evidence-based solutions, because we can say that gender in trade is very important because we realize that trade might have different impacts on men and women. But do we actually know? And the answer, at least for us in the Netherlands, is at the moment we actually don't know. For instance, we know that market access for agricultural goods was increased heavily, and we can underpin that with facts and figures and projections for I'm talking about the trade agreement between Canada and the EU. It will bring us a lot of market access in goods, and it will have an enormous economic impact. But do we know how the economic impact will be on men and women? We don't, actually. And do we know the impact of opening up or protecting certain low-wage sectors or services with high percentage of female employees when negotiating trade agreements? We actually do know not. So what we need to do as a first step is that we have to build an understanding of the sectors where women are likely affected negatively or positively, for that matter, by trade. And we need to understand the differential effects of trade policy on women and make trade policy gender responsive, and thereby linking trade policy to broader discussions on Agenda 2030 and leaving no one behind. In short, the impact of the declaration should eventually be that we get rights-laden trade agreements and trade-minded labor agreements. So what we need to do is research, I told that, look at best practices, but also not shy away from taking on board less best practices, because, you know, sometimes the painful things or the things that really did not happen make it easier to learn. It might be a learning experience. The Netherlands, we will commission the OECD with a research project to investigate what, let's say, the impact of trade and gender on trade might be. So that is what we will do in the future. What we also need is interagency cooperation. We need to de-silo the United Nations organizations and the World Trade Organizations and other international organizations that matter. We need the WTO to engage with the ILO. We need the ILO to engage with UNCTAD, and they do that We know that, but it needs to be on a higher and strategic level. And the Netherlands here in Geneva has started a strategic dialogue on responsible business conduct and global value chains, engaging the top-level management of all these international organizations and the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. And responsible business is also including the gender perspective. And the World Business Council is included because I think it's not a matter of only public organizations, but we should really need to engage private sector as well if we want to make women empowerment actually happen. Also mentioned by the ambassador, we need aid for trade programs and projects better tuned to gender issues. And we need programs such as She Trades of ITC. And I heard Arantxa say that now we have 500,000 women empowered by the program, but we should aim for more. I think in 2018 the new ambition is 1 million, and I think we should all join forces to make that happen.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Madam Ackerman. It's truly insightful. I think what you had to say about the linkages between government, business, and then men and women are so apt. You will remember during the financial crisis when the ready-made garment industry, for example, was so negatively impacted at that time, and many of the responses of some governments was to invest in the construction sector, which is a standard Keynesian response in these moments of crisis. Invest in construction, schools, hospitals, and roads. Yet it was the ready-made garment sector which had been hit. And when you think about the jobs, the ready-made garments is largely women losing their jobs there, and yet the employment opportunities were being created in the construction sector. So it isn't just about policy, as you say, it really is about the people that are impacted by the policy. So I think what you had to say about moving from the paper to the photo, I think the more we get the faces in mind here. Trade is not about the products. Trade is about the people who provide the products, the men and women who provide the goods and services. And it's the faces that we need to keep in mind as we go forward. The World Bank, Pierre Sauvé. Pierre has joined us this afternoon to provide the World Bank's perspective on some of their work in very important areas that are specifically mentioned in the Declaration on Trade and Women's Economic Empowerment. That's financial inclusion, procurement, data analysis, and trade facilitation. Pierre himself is the senior trade specialist at the World Bank Group Geneva office and the Office of the Special Representative to the United Nations and the World Trade Organization. Pierre has written extensively on WTO matters, including trade and investment and trade in services, and is also presented in interesting areas like the digital dividends, the digital divide, of course, being another area where we have an egregious gap in terms of women and girls' access to and usage of digital platforms. So without any further ado, Pierre, your thoughts on the substance we have before us today, please.
Thank you, Meg, and thanks for the invitation. It's great to be already brainstorming just a mere week, less than a week, after the signature of this important declaration. So I welcome very much this opportunity. The question you asked me, because we exchanged questions before this panel, this is not completely improvised, was will the declaration change the way the World Bank does business? Will it change the nature of the services and the activities we provide? The short answer is no, it won't. And it won't because, of course, the World Bank has been working on a large number of gender fronts for quite some time. The bank itself has had a sort of holistic gender policy for several years now. And an important aspect of that work has been in recent years to provide particular focus to the gender dimensions of the 14 practice groups that constitute the World Bank. The World Bank is divided into 14 areas of intervention, one of which, to which I belong, is the Trade and Competitiveness Global Practice. And so we have been working in recent years on contextualizing what gender mainstreaming means in a trade and competitiveness context. And of course, that work is ongoing, even though it is a relatively new area. And anything that is new is something in which you are essentially, I would say, in learning by doing mode. And you make mistakes, and Elsbeth is right. I think you learn more from your mistakes than from what works. And I think that's very much the spirit the bank wants to bring to the follow-up of the declaration. So is it going to change anything to what we do and how we do things? Probably not. But it provides a very important anchor, I think, to highlight what we do and a platform to exchange and to derive lessons on what we're trying to do. And in the spirit of learning, to be very honest in sharing insights on what works and what doesn't. Now, as I said earlier, the bank has been driven by gender considerations for some time. That strategy, a bank-wide, World Bank-wide strategy, if you want, is rooted in essentially 5 pillars or 5 objectives. One is removing constraints to more, better, and better paid jobs, because typically women are victims of gender pay discrimination that is quite obscene at similar levels of qualifications. So how can we orient our interventions with a view not only to sustain employment, which is the first source of human dignity, to be employed and to be productive in society, but to make sure that also all workers are on an equal footing in terms of the benefits they derive from productive activities. Second core pillar is removing obstacles to women's ownership and control of assets. Women have enormous difficulties in accessing finance. They face tremendous discrimination, sometimes the obligation to have permission from husbands or spouses to open a bank account and so on. And so in access to resources that allow entrepreneurship to flourish, there are very significant impediments that have to be addressed. The bank produces every year a very interesting publication called Women, Business, and the Law, in which we try to document clinically instances of overt and indirect discrimination in the laws and regulations of member states of the bank. The third objective is, of course, to increase voice and agency. You cannot be an agent if you have no voice. And so a lot of bank interventions are targeted at providing opportunities for women to be organized and for their voice to carry. And when that voice carries, results are produced, more likely to be produced for sure. Fourth objective, improving human endowments. How can a society be fully exploiting its human endowments if half of its population does not enjoy full and equal access to knowledge, to education, and to the opportunities that flow from that? And so, of course, a core aspect of World Bank interventions is centered on access to knowledge, educational opportunities. And then finally, a fifth pillar of the bank strategy is to engage men in the conversation, because that's where the problem lies for the most part, between the 2 ears of men. And so engaging not only men, but boys. In other words, focusing on gender issues even in the design of educational reforms and educational curricula, sensitizing society to the importance of gender balances and gender equality. So that is, if you want, the framework within which we have been trying, within trade and competitiveness, to situate a gender conversation. And as Meg has highlighted, several aspects of that work are areas in which we are trying to devote very specific attention to address issues of financial inclusion that impede the ability of women-led firms to engage in cross-border activities, to provide greater ease of access to women-led firms to procurement markets, because the data we have shows that firms led by women do not get a fair share of public procurement contracts. There's tremendous bias in the way these systems operate. Often not an explicit bias. It's not written in law, but it's the way the system operates that tends to be biased towards always the same firms or operators, the majority of which are male-owned and operated, and so on and so forth. So all of these areas that the Declaration highlights, I think, are areas in which we're trying to pay attention in our work. Now, in our own strategy, in contextualizing this World Bank-wide strategy, we start, as we always do, I'm going to engage in a bit of techno-speak here, but the way the bank works is to say, what is your theory of change? What does that mean? How do we get from point A to point B? Point B being a gender-equal outcome, gender-equal societies in which women are fully empowered to be productive contributors to economic advancement. What is the theory of change? How do we get there? And that theory is a simple one. Economic growth, as Albert has very clearly said, economic growth and competitiveness requires gender equality. Societies that remain unequal among genders are societies that are not as productive as they can or should be. So it's a very simple proposition that gender equality is going to result in greater economic growth, greater economic opportunities, and will make societies more competitive, better able to cope with and be resilient to the changes that buffet our economies. Now, how do we do that? That seems very sort of pious and beautiful, but how do we go from a theory of change to actually concrete deliverables? We do that basically in 4 areas. One, in our work on improving the business climate, in our work on improving work conditions and trading environments. The problem in trade, from a gender perspective, is not a problem of rules per se, certainly not trade rules. Trade rules are anchored in the principle, in the very principle of non-discrimination. But it's trading environments, as I just said, in access to finance, in access to procurement markets. It's trading environments, it's business environments that tend to be tilted very often in informal manners towards male-oriented outcomes and so on. So we try to sensitize our clients to these realities and to try to come up, if there are explicit sources of discrimination, of course, to remove them. And if the discrimination is more of an informal nature, to sensitize decision makers to be proactive in taking account of these impacts. The second, of course, very much following up on what Elsbeth said, this is the problem of talking after you. You stole all my punchlines. You could see my text as you spoke. You were looking here. I know. I saw that.
But thank you for supporting me.
How could I not? The Netherlands is one of our most cherished donors, of course. We love the Dutch.
I thought supporting my arguments for women empowerment here.
So
thank you.
I mean,
that in a bigger
substantively, that's what I'm doing, of course. But I'm here to declare my love to you as a donor as well. The second core objective is, of course, to focus on market access opportunities, sectors in which we know, without having full data is always problematic, but you know intuitively where women are employed intensively, what sectors are going to be most affected and generate the kinds of gender-positive outcomes we're looking for. And it is sectors like ready-made garments. It is sectors like tourism. It is predominantly agriculture, where a very large number of very poor women work in informal market conditions and so on. So how can we, in reviving one aspect of the WTO that is broken, which is the liberalization function. You may have noticed that at the WTO, the only thing we agree on when we do, and we rarely do, is rules. But opening markets, that's become almost like a bad word. That's almost taboo. Opening, liberalizing, and yet the benefits of trade come from the removal of impediments to trade and cross-border investment. And for that, we need negotiated outcomes. So in restoring momentum to the broken liberalization machinery of the WTO, or in encouraging countries to embrace regional or unilateral forms of liberalization, we try to sensitize our clients to the fact that sectors are not neutral from a gender perspective, and if we want to promote women opportunities, we should focus on sectors in which those opportunities are found. The third pillar, I'm almost finished, is of course strengthening the productivity and competitiveness of female workers, managers, and entrepreneurs. Very recently, we launched a new fund, the Women's Entrepreneurship Fund, that we hope will leverage $1 billion of investments in female-led enterprises. It's an IFC-led initiative that benefits from donations from a large number of donors, including Saudi Arabia, to the tune of $100 million. And it's important that this money be spent in empowering workers, female managers, and female-owned entrepreneurs, female-owned enterprises, if we are to realize the benefits we're looking for. And then finally, what does increasing voice and agency mean in a trade context? It means essentially helping countries design institutions of governance, institutions of consultation, public-private forms of dialogue that are inclusive, that are alert to the fact that 50% of our population is female, that a very large segment and a very vibrant segment of our economies comes from female-run institutions. And so increasing voice and agency means essentially designing institutions of trade policy formulation that are themselves inclusive. Let me stop there because I think I've spoken enough, and I want to come back in saying, what do we plan to do next? We have a couple of very interesting initiatives that are in the pipeline, but I think that will respond to the next question.
Thank you very much, Pierre. I don't know if you've noticed or not, this constellation, the stars are lining up here. We have the declaration adopted last week on trade and women's economic empowerment, and Pierre just spoke about the Women Entrepreneurs Fund. Saudi Arabia put in 100 million, so already there's some money there on the supply side in terms of fostering the development of women-owned enterprises. These, of course, can feed into some very important areas specifically mentioned in the declaration, and that Pierre touched on as well, like procurement. Research shows that women-owned companies only win an estimated 1% of contracts, whether they're government contracts or contracts in the private sector. This is a multi-trillion-dollar industry, and yet women are only winning about 1% of those contracts. And if you're selling to the government is, of course, an excellent client to have because they're here today, they're here tomorrow. If you sell pens to the Press Club in Geneva this year, chances are you can bid for the next contract the next year and build on that. So the procurement market is a very important market. We've got some money coming down, but we need to also look at the rules. WTO rules. Okay, government procurement. It's a plurilateral agreement, which differentiates from other agreements. We have here today Dr. Arthur Appleton to talk to us a little bit more about the legal interpretation of the Marrakesh Agreement. Is the adoption of the declaration going to change the way we look at the Marrakesh Agreement establishing the WTO or not? If so, how? Prior to that, Arthur is let me introduce Arthur. He's the co-founder and principal of the law firm Appleton Luff. He has more than 25 years of experience in the field of international trade, dating from in the late 1980s, when he advised a prominent Asian country during the Uruguay round of trade negotiations. He divides his practice between international trade and investment law and international arbitration. He's worked extensively in Asia, Africa, the Middle East, and Latin America with business, governments, international organizations, and non-governmental organizations on various international trade issues. Dr. Appleton focuses on trade questions concerning, I'm going to read out the specific areas of WTO law in case any of you want to ask specific questions in these areas. He works on concerning investment, particularly the BITS and the TRIMS agreement, dispute settlement, technical regulations and standards, in particular the TBT agreement, health and sanitary measures, SPS agreement, intellectual property, the TRIPS agreement, accessions and the environment, including climate change, as well as questions concerning regional trade agreements. I know Arthur because I was the first president of Geneva Women in International Trade that we formed in 2000. One of our aims was to bring an understanding of the gender perspective to the directors of the WTO and the member states of the WTO. That was back in 2001. And Arthur Appleton was the first male member of Geneva Women in International Trade back in 2001. Arthur, you have the floor. So the declaration's been adopted. What does this mean for the interpretation of the WTO agreements?
Thank you, Meg, for that very warm introduction. It's a great pleasure to be here and to talk about the legal perspective. Don't all leave the room. It's not as bad as it sounds. But I do have bad news and good news. The bad news is that from a legal perspective, this declaration doesn't mean much. The good news is that it may mean a lot in the future. Let me try to explain that. When we look at the WTO rules, we have to realize that the appellate body is charged with applying the covered agreements. These are the texts that make up the WTO agreement. That's their mission, that's their role, that's their responsibility. For questions of interpretation, the declaration may eventually have meaning, but it doesn't yet. From questions of the law of the WTO agreement, the declaration is not a waiver, it is not a legal interpretation, it was not adopted by a vote of the members in a WTO forum. It's not an authoritative interpretation. However, when we look at the preamble of the WTO agreement, there are possible areas of overlap that may eventually become important as the movement behind the declaration becomes important. Let me say something that Meg did not say. I teach trade law at Johns Hopkins University and in Barcelona and Bern and many other places, and my students are all young and idealistic and interested in gender issues, interested in human rights, interested in environment, interested in the trade and debate. And these issues are important for all of us because it's the future of our families, the future of our society. And we look at environment, we look at historic decisions like shrimp turtle or the other environmental decisions, we start to see how the preamble of the WTO agreement was interpreted. And we see that the notion of sustainable development was interpreted in light of the Rio and other instruments, the Stockholm Declaration, that became important in the development of environmental law. So what does that mean? Well, we take a close look at the preamble, and we see that the preamble speaks of barriers to trade. Yes, when this was written, they were probably talking about non-tariff barriers, but when we look at the declaration, we see that the fourth principle also speaks of barriers. When we talk about integration into the multilateral trade system, we realize that they were looking at other agreements probably and other portions of society, other aspects of the multilateral trade system. But maybe integration will have a new meaning in the future as well for gender issues. Don't forget, in the shrimp turtle case, the appellate body said that we follow the doctrine of evolutionary interpretation. The words can develop over time and have a different meaning. So we see some possibilities for integration, also in the idea of raising standards of living and achieving full employment. So there is some light at the end of the tunnel for interpreting this agreement, but there are obstacles. The word inclusiveness is missing from the preamble of the WTO agreement. And that may have been okay in 1994, 1995. It's not okay now. I'm a firm believer in the principles that are behind this declaration, and I see the importance of inclusiveness. So, what can we say? We can say that the road we're on is a long road, and the declaration in many ways represents an important step. It's not the first step. Back in 2005, I published a 3-volume book on trade law, and we had a 60-page chapter written by Eugenia McGill on gender issues. People have been following this issue for a very long time. She started the chapter by saying trade falls in the intersection between economics and law, both of which are very mysterious fields that claim to be gender neutral. Now, some of my earlier writing, I said that when it comes to environment, the WTO agreement doesn't take a position. It's agnostic. You could make the same argument for gender and for human rights as well. but that was an early piece of writing. We've come a long way now. We're looking for positive obligations. We're looking for something more transformational. And that's why I believe that the gender declaration is important. It's the beginning of what I would call a transformational movement. Why? Because it has 120 some sponsors, which is 3/4 of the WTO. If these sponsors got behind their ideas at the WTO, there may be more room for eventually an authoritative interpretation of the preamble and other factors. So I want you to see the declaration as the beginnings of the formation of soft law, just like the Stockholm Convention, other important documents that may lead to something bigger in the long run. I think we need to have that kind of positive approach. We need to see law as something that can be evolutionary, that can be transformational. But to get there, we need to take the first step. Now, having said that, and that's the good news, I want to say that there's a national policy dimension that we can't forget as well. When we look at the sponsors of the declaration, we see that the United States is missing. I would say the disunited States at this moment, given what's happening in the United States. We see also the GCC is missing. We see some important players that I hope will become more involved in this debate. Because the more WTO members that get behind an instrument like this, the more vitality it will have. To end on a legal note, when we talk about interpreting the WTO, we get down to the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties. I assume most of you all happily are not lawyers in the room, but we know from the Boeing Airbus decision that in interpreting the agreement, Article 31.3c talks about the parties to other agreements. And there's a big debate about what that means from the idea of trying to build a coherent international law that would bring together environment, human rights, gender issues. And it's quite clear that the more WTO participants we have on board, the more important and the easier it will be to have a common interpretive instrument. So what I would charge you with is to try to convince the national leaders in your countries who are absent from sponsorship to become more involved in this, because it is a very, very important beginning. And I think it's a beginning, but an important beginning. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Arthur. And that's a call out to you. If your government was not on the list that Ambassador Aspelund showed at the beginning here, then do call on them to support the declaration. So we're seeing that the declaration has great support. Arthur, you called it transformational. And Ambassador Aspelund, you talked about the energy in the room, that this is something which is not just an agreement which has been adopted, but there's an energy and enthusiasm there. And you went through some of the points, some of the commitments in the declaration. One of them was to exchange good practices over the next 2 years. And what are good practices? I think Pierre gave us one good example there. They work on trade facilitation. He mentioned women, informal, cross-border traders. Boy, were these women off the radar screen when we first started talking about trade facilitation. These women were not there. We were simply registering the value and the volume of goods crossing borders. We were not looking at the people who were transporting those goods. We were not looking at conditions. We were not looking at simple things like the fact that there are no toilets for women at many border crossings, that women are subjected to sexual harassment. They're asked to pay duties and taxes, which have been phased out through one trade agreement or another. They don't know. The customs officers don't tell them. There's a strong gender dimension to this. So when someone tells you something is gender neutral, think again, ask again, and really think about where are women in this picture and what we can do about that. Elspeth mentioned some of the work of the Netherlands. I mean, even something relatively simple like who's on your trade delegations. You know, this is something really, who are you putting in front of the buyers, you know? How many men, how many women? Because we need to have the women entrepreneurs as part of those delegations to meet buyers, so that if they're successful and they win a big contract and they need to scale up production. I mean, Pierre told us about the 100 million that we have now in the Women Entrepreneurs Fund that could be potentially accessible for that. So we have the political commitment, we've got the energy in the room. What's your question to the panelists? Q&A. Floor is open. Do identify yourself, and if you have a specific question for one of the panelists or all of the panelists, if you'd like to make that known as well, please. Thank you. Please. Judith.
Thank you. Judith Fessehaye from ICTSD. I think the first question I have is really for Dr. Appleton. I thought the reason why so many countries joined the declaration was exactly because it was not going to go towards that direction. So it's actually also a question for the Ambassador Aspelund, who has been involved in the process. Maybe correct me if I'm wrong. I remember the discussions before the declaration were actually that so many, especially developing countries, were very worried about rulemaking in this field. And now you're telling us that actually that's potentially the direction we are going. So I just wanted a clarification there, and whether really there is a political will to go into the direction from the majority of the member states who joined the declaration. And the second question is, it seems that when we talk about gender and trade agreements, a lot of ambitions have actually been placed within the context of the regional trade agreements. And that's between both developed countries and developing countries. So there is a lot of interest, there are a lot of interesting developments there. And I just wanted to ask you what your thoughts are on there, and which level of ambitions do you think countries may have, with gender chapters in regional trade agreements, whether we can push the boundaries a bit more than what has been done so far. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Do we have a second question at the moment? Okay, you want to take time to reflect? Take time to reflect, and we'll go to Ambassador Aspelund, please.
Yes, thank you. Maybe I'll throw off the picture there. That's a good one to answer that question. That's this one. Yeah. There were some demonstrations in Buenos Aires, and some important points were made. This is directly linked to your question on the rulemaking. This means pink washing new issues. I mean, this is a conversation point that we can have a long discussion about. The point made there is some countries, they would like to see new issues dealt with in WTO, others they don't. And by explaining how the new issues would be good for gender equality, would be pink washing new issues. So that's the point that's made. I would rather maybe turn it the other way around and say, if there is a consensus in WTO to take up new issues, is the color of them a good enough mixture of pink and blue? So the declaration itself is not about rulemaking at all. It's more about understanding better how trade plays a role when it comes to gender equality. And we will ask questions, for instance, to understand what it is actually that impedes women's participation in trade. Do women have less access to finance? Why are female representation in company boards only 14%? How can we address these issues? So these are the questions that we are asking, and we simply want a discussion on the issue and to find out. The aim was not to make WTO rules on the issue.
Thank you very much. Ambassador Arthur, please.
The WTO has been hesitant to dig too deeply or go too deeply into the trade and environment debate, the trade and human rights debate, and now the trade and gender debate. The members see this as a trade forum. But don't let that bother you, Judith, because we see that as civil society pressure has increased in areas like trade, the WTO has become more trade sensitive. As international legal pressure has increased, it's paid much more attention to international law. Don't forget the early environmental cases, reformulated gasoline, shrimp turtle, just to name a couple, where the WTO appellate body was very conscious of what was happening outside of the members' area. Yes, it would be wonderful if this happened in the WTO, but let's realize we can't change all national legal issues in the WTO. Part of the movement has to come from the bottom up. It's not just going to be top down. So I wouldn't worry so much about that. Your second question on RTAs is in fact quite interesting, because as WTO as the negotiations have slowed down, as the work in progress has been stymied, we see much more movement going in the area of RTAs. Meg brought my attention to one of the Canadian RTAs that talks about corporate social responsibility and mentions gender equality. You also told me that the Venezuela-Chile RTA has similar language. So we start to see that the gender issue is moving to the regional level. And we start to see that in communities like the EU, tremendous sensitivity to gender issues. So it doesn't necessarily happen in Geneva, may happen at the regional level as well. And what happens at the regional level eventually, I think, will find its way to Geneva. Don't just look at this from the top down. Look at this from a process of bottom up as well.
Thank you very much, Arthur. Yeah, it's Chile, Canada, and Chile, Uruguay that have the gender clause in them, and also Article 31 of the Cotonou Agreement as well is very specific on calling upon members. Similar language to what's in the declaration in terms of cooperation that shall help strengthen policies and programs that improve, ensure, and broaden the equal participation of men and women in all spheres of political, economic, and social and cultural life. And then there's a series of sub-points under that Article 31 Cotonou Agreement that you might like to consult if you're specifically interested in the legal aspects. Madame, you have a question.
Thank you, and I needed a bit of time because I was trying to shift my comments and ideas into questions, so to fit your format. I'm Julie Aymon from the Canadian Mission, covering mostly trade and development aspects, so I'm in that trade and universe a lot. Let me first thank you for this session, which is indeed, we're a few days. I still have half of my colleagues that have not come back from Buenos Aires, and our lead people on this actually are still, I think, enjoying steaks and Malbec down south in much nicer weather, I hear. I guess to frame what I had to say into a question, I guess the easy part, I think, is behind us. Getting 120 people to be in a picture is great. The symbol is important. It's a small step, yet it's a big step. I think we've turned from being how gender neutral to stopping being gender blind, which for me is a kind of pretty different. Maybe there is nothing that needs to be done in the rules area, but we need to at least have a look and see if something could be done. If the answer is no, it's no. If it's elsewhere, it's elsewhere. So I think this is really good in changing the mindset. I don't think we're going to have a lot of problems mobilizing the Canadian government into finding all sorts of ways to try to implement or do as much as we can. But those who are in the picture and maybe are not there yet, but made that step, which is good. What can we do, what can be done to bring them on board and to actually not just wait for the next photo up, but also getting more engaged? What can be done here? What can we do elsewhere? I think that's kind of starting the brainstorm here now, and maybe eventually we'll have to, really get into action. So there you go.
Thank you very much. Pastor Aspen, would you like to respond on behalf of the perspective of the international gender champions in terms of the work that's being done there as a forum to bring other interested parties on board and to encourage others to join? Yeah, exactly.
This paper that I mentioned that appeared in 2005 in this book that I edited, the author came out with 5 recommendations that I thought were very, very interesting. Affirmative steps to increase women in senior positions in the Secretariat and National Trade Ministries, gender analysis of proposed trade commitments, impact assessments of existing trade obligations on gender, affirmative steps to include women and men with expertise in gender and human development on the WTO appellate body, establishment of an expert panel on gender, human development, and trade, which could serve as a resource at the Secretariat. The 5 simple ideas that at least move in the right direction.
Yes, please, thank you. First, on the regional trade agreements, when I speak as a representative of the Icelandic government, we will definitely continue to work on including gender issues in all our regional trade agreements from now on. Regarding the initiative of the gender champions in Geneva, as I mentioned earlier, there is a group, the Trade Impact Working Group, that was established in December 2016. That group will continue to work on the issue on numerous fields. The declaration we are discussing today is one of the issues the working group is working on, and to include the gender issues in regional trade negotiations is one of the issues that the group is also working on.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Aspelund. This is one of the beauties of having a trade impact group as part of the International Gender Champions is that you're in good company. You're in good company. It's a place where the representatives of the member states that aren't yet supporting the declaration can go and listen and learn with a view to being able to better brief capital to make the argument that this is something that we do want to identify ourselves with. It's in the interests of our women entrepreneurs, that our country and women more generally in our economy, that we're part of this movement, and so we can get traction that way. Another way, I know the ITC, International Trade Centre, worked in this area. The ITC organised a high-level meeting on the gender dimension of the Enhanced Integrated Framework. Now, I raise that because, as we know, a lot of the WTO non-discrimination is about access to an equal opportunity for developing countries. And so the ITC looked at the Enhanced Integrated Framework, which is a mechanism for accessing funding to enhance trade in developing countries. What is the gender dimension to that? And what can we do to go forward? Best practices captured. That's actually on the WTO website and the ITC website, if I recall correctly. You have vignettes of the participants from states and other groups talking about the gender dimension in developing countries and what can be done to go forward. And what can be done to go forward? Right. So now we move to that part of the session where you said, so rightly expressed, perhaps that was the easy part. Getting the declaration drafted, securing 120 sponsors, supporters, co-sponsors for this particular declaration. Where to from here? So I'm going to first turn back to the Ambassador of Iceland for a few words on where to from here. Can I just take this opportunity to point out, as a representative, you said you're representative of the government of Iceland. Great. Iceland, for the 9th year in a row, came out #1 in the World Economic Forum's Global Gap Index report. 9th year in a row. I'm sure that wasn't an accident, Ambassador. How did Iceland get there?
How did Iceland get there? Yeah, that's a very difficult question to answer. I don't know. No, I mean, Iceland, we will continue to work on this, of course, as we have always been doing. One issue that has been mentioned here also today, gender equality benefits all, both men and women. And for that reason, we believe in Iceland that men should be engaged in the fight for gender equality because it would benefit them. And the Icelandic government has been organizing some international events we call Baba Shops, where we want men to engage in the fight for gender equality. And these events have been extremely successful, if I would say. And we would like to continue on that track to work on engaging men in the fight for gender equality because it benefits all. But what takes on from now on, I mean, we have been asking some questions in the declaration, and we have lined up series of events that we would like to organize, and my government will continue to work on these pages of the declaration and in collaboration with the members supporting it, and simply start by exchanging views on the issues on what we can do to work jointly on closing the gender gap. Gender equality is a cross-cutting issue and shouldn't be polarized. We should always keep in mind that women are half of the population. Women are also half of minority groups. So it isn't an issue to be polarized. It's about all of us. And gender equality is about all of us. And if there is equality, I would think the world would be a better place.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. And of course, one of the practices at the national level of the Government of Iceland is gender budgeting. That's actually tracking the amount of government budget that goes in support of initiatives that support women. Tracking the budget is a very important aspect, something we need to see a little bit more in Aid for Trade, for example. And that was something that we looked at the ITC in terms of the budget for the Enhanced Integrated Framework, to what degree women were benefiting from that work. I'll go now to the Netherlands, Elspeth.
Yeah, so the Netherlands is not on number one of this WEF list. So I think that means that we have some work to do, and that is a fact. And we will take inspiration from Iceland. No, without kidding, in the Netherlands we have gender issues as well. I mean, it's about equal payment, equal treatment. And we need to tackle that, and I know that in our new government that is on the top of the agenda, and also from a perspective of policy coherence. So what we do, let's say, in an integral basis. When it comes to the work that we do here in Geneva on the topic, I think small steps can make a big difference. So we look at the staffing of our mission. You referred to panels. I mean, it can't be let's say practice anymore that that when you have a panel on a certain topic, also on gender issues, that it is an all-male panel. That's not. I mean, it should be more balanced, and reasoning that they just don't have the knowledge, or we could not find them. That is so out of the question. We can't do that anymore. So, let's take the effort to also mind smaller events and do the things that are within our own influence, and I think the smaller things will eventually lead to a bigger result. Bigger results we foresee in Aid for Trade programs. We are one of the larger donors worldwide in Aid for Trade. I don't know where exactly we are on the list, but I think it's around somewhere in the top 10, and that means that we are rather influential, and we will make sure that whatever we do with an eye to women empowerment, but maybe equal treatment, because I liked what Pierre said, that women empowerment only happens if, let's say, they have the room to actually do that, to get the opportunity, and that is a matter of both genders that, let's say, the world is having. So that's what we do. I also refer to the research that we will commission the OECD with related to the gender aspects of trade policy, both in positive and in negative senses. Have a look at the different sectors, the different measures. I think gathering the best and the less best practices, but also share them. So I think we should seek every opportunity to come up with, to seek every opportunity to present the intermediate results that we gain, or the end results that we gain, and have a dialogue on that. And what we also do, but that is more sustainability and responsible business oriented, but that of course includes the gender perspective, is this strategic dialogue on responsible business conduct in global supply chains, or in global value chains, I should actually say. But we also initiated a dialogue here in Geneva on investment for sustainable development. And that goes also in the direction, or that includes also the discussion about how to empower women, how to empower business and women in business.
Exactly. Thank you very much, Elspeth. On this session, we have largely government and institutional panelists. In some future panels, we're also going to include the corporate perspective and the voice of civil society organizations, and the voices of women as well, who, of course, we seek to serve through the implementation of the agenda. Of course, the position of women in global value chains, absolutely critical, and we'll be addressing that particularly in our seminar on procurement. Pierre, please.